kiss me before dawn," said the Duke of Merryworth, laying his hand flat on the wager book at White's so that the page would not turn under him. "And I shall know your engagement was a lie." He said it loud enough that Lord Henry Sefton, who was standing at his elbow with a glass of claret already half lifted, lowered the glass and forgot to drink. He said it loud enough that Mr. Tobias Vance, who had been arguing tonnage figures across the next table, stopped mid-sentence and turned his head as though a window had blown open behind him. He said it loud enough that the steward, who had been carrying a tray of empty bottles toward the service stair, paused on the second step and waited to see whether to come back. The footman dipped his pen and held it ready. The Duke, in that moment, did not look like a man who had been drinking. He looked like a man who had been thinking too long about something he did not wish to think about, and had decided the way out was a public sentence.
"Merworth," said Sefton, very quietly. "Do you mean to enter this in the book?"
"I do."
"You will lose your engagement."
"I shall lose 3 engagements," said the Duke, and he smiled the smile that had ruined a perfectly good morning for half of London at one time or another. "Yours, Vance's, mine, which is exactly the number of engagements that ought, by my private accounting, to be unmade before Whitsuntide. 3 brides, 1 dawn. Merworth Castle, the morning after the Easter ball. The wager is this. Any of the 3 of us, any one, who is found kissing his betrothed before sunrise that morning in the orangery, wins. Any of the 3 who is not, loses. Loses the engagement, loses the settlement, loses indeed the right to call the lady his promised wife. The lady, I should add, may withdraw at any time for any reason. She may walk past the orangery and read a novel by candlelight in the breakfast room without prejudice. Only the gentleman bears the wager." "You are mad," said Vance, in the flat tone of a man calculating interest. "I am, on the contrary, the only sober person in this room. Sefton, do you love Lady Amelia?" Sefton did not answer. "Vance, do you love Miss Cecilia?" Vance looked at the ceiling, which had been painted with a remarkable battle by Sir Joshua's pupil, and which had nothing to do with the question. "And I," said the Duke, "do not love Lady Sophronia, whom I have promised to marry in June, whose father has, this very evening, requested I name the day, whose mother has selected the bridal silk and engaged the rector at St. George's, and ordered the wedding breakfast from Gunter's, all without troubling me." He spread his fingers on the open page. "I propose, gentlemen, that we let the dawn decide for us. 3 brides, 3 orangery doors, 1 cold morning. The footman, if you would be so good, will read it back." The footman read it back. His voice did not shake. He had been 4 months at White's, and had already written into the book a wager on the weight of an archbishop, a wager on the colour of the regent's next waistcoat, and a wager on whether Lord Petersham could be persuaded to fall in love with his own snuff-box. He had also written, last Tuesday, a wager on whether a certain dressmaker in Bond Street would be ruined by Lady Jersey's verdict before Easter. The dressmaker had been ruined. The footman had learned not to be moved by sentences. "The Duke of Merryworth," he read, "Lord Henry Sefton, and Mr. Tobias Vance wager their respective engagements that any one of them, found kissing his promised wife in the orangery at Merryworth Castle before sunrise on the morning of the 28th of March, 1815, shall be held to have won. Any not so found shall be held to have lost. The lady's word being final as to whether the kiss took place, and being binding upon all parties without further evidence required. Signed, this evening." The Duke took the pen and signed. Sefton, after a breath that came from somewhere lower than his chest, signed. Vance, who had not finished his arithmetic, signed last, and rather small. The wager book closed. The candle on the steward's tray guttered. Out in St. James's Street, a chair carried a lady past the window, who turned her head at the sound of the door and was gone. 3 engagements, 3 brides, 1 orangery, 8 days. The dare was in.
Miss Clara Ashbrook had no engagement to lose. She had never had one. She had a green wool travelling cloak, a small leather-bound copy of Mr. Cooper's poems given her by her father the year before he died, 12 shillings sewn into the lining of her glove, and a letter of engagement as governess to Miss Pip Whitmore, youngest sister of Lady Amelia Whitmore, betrothed of Lord Henry Sefton, for the Easter fortnight at Merryworth Castle. She was 24. She was a curate's daughter from the parish of Stow-on-the-Marsh. She had, that afternoon, climbed down from the post-chaise at the great gates of Merryworth, and discovered that the carriage which was to take her up the long drive had broken a spring, and that no one was coming for her. She set down her trunk on the verge, and considered her position. The hawthorn was just beginning to flower along the wall, the first warm afternoon of the year, and the green-edged hedgerows had a brightness that hurt her eyes after London smoke. A blackbird was singing on the gatepost, as though it had been promised her arrival. "It is 2 miles to the house, miss," said the gatekeeper, who had come out with his cap in his hand and was looking at her trunk with the grave practicality of a man who had carried other trunks up other drives. "I would offer to walk it up for you, only my knee. There's the orangery path. That's shorter by half if you don't mind the mud." "I do not mind mud," said Clara, which was true. Mud, she had found, was the most honest thing about country life. She picked up her travelling case, which weighed less than her conscience, but more than her ambition, and she set off up the orangery path. She had walked perhaps half a mile when she realized that the path was not the path the gatekeeper had described. He had said it skirted the lake. This one climbed. He had said she would see the chapel on her left within a quarter of an hour. She saw no chapel. She saw, at the head of the rise, a long, low building of brick and glass, set against the south wall of a kitchen garden, with the panes catching the afternoon sun in such a way that the whole structure seemed, briefly, to be on fire. She stopped. She had never seen an orangery before. She had read of them. Mr. Cooper had a line about glass houses that her father used to quote when the curate's small greenhouse had blown down in a March gale. She set her case down on the gravel and looked at the building for what she afterwards calculated must have been almost a full minute, in which she did nothing but breathe and let the brightness press against her face. When she turned her head, she saw the man. He was leaning against the brick corner of the orangery with his arms folded, and an expression that suggested he had been there for some time, and had been watching her for at least the last half of it. He was tall, broad in the shoulder under a riding coat the colour of indigo, his throat bare to the spring air, his hair the colour of wet leaves and not quite tidy at the temples. He held a pair of gloves in one hand, half on, half off, as though he had not decided whether to come or to go. He did not bow. He did not straighten. He looked at her with the alert, slightly amused gravity of a man who has just discovered an unexpected line in a ledger and would rather like to know what it is doing there. "You are not," he said, in a voice that was lower than she had been prepared for, "any of the 3 brides I am expecting." Clara felt her shoulders settle. The blackbird sang again, farther off, in some unseen hedge. "I am not any kind of bride," she said. "I am the new governess. I beg your pardon. I have lost the proper path." "You have not lost the path. The path has lost you. They are not the same thing." He pushed away from the wall in one unhurried motion, and crossed the gravel to her, and stopped 2 paces off, courteously, neither closer nor farther than the line a gentleman would draw with a stranger on the second day of acquaintance. "Forgive me. I had been promised a Whitmore, a Branwell, and a— what was the third? A Pencarrow, in the company of their mothers, by the 4 o'clock train of carriages. Instead, the drive has produced you." He looked at her again, more carefully. "You are quite certain you are not a bride?" "I am quite certain." "It is a pity. I had a question I wished to ask the first one who arrived." "You may ask it of me. I have no opinion on bridal matters,
but I have a serviceable opinion on most other subjects." He smiled.
It was, she thought, the smile of a man who had not expected anyone to take him quite at his word, and was now reassessing the afternoon. She read it, fairly or not, as the smile of a man who had been preparing for boredom, and had just been given something else. "Then perhaps," he said, "you will walk with me as far as the kitchen garden door. I shall carry your case. The under-butler will meet you at the green baize door and conduct you to Miss Pip's schoolroom, which is on the second floor north, and at which point you will have no further reason to speak to me at all, which will be a relief to both of us." He took her case before she could object. It seemed not to weigh in his hand. He set off along the wall at a pace she could match without hurrying, and at his shoulder she noticed at last what she had been too distracted by the orangery to see, that his right hand, when it closed on the leather handle, was not quite steady. That he had been, before she came up the rise, doing something she had interrupted, and that he had not yet, in his own private accounting, finished it. "Whom should I ask for," she said, "when I reach the green baize door?" "Ask for Merryworth," he said, without turning his head. The schoolroom at Merryworth was on the second floor north, as he had promised, with 2 tall windows overlooking the kitchen garden and the orangery beyond, and a slate floor that had been swept that morning, and a coal fire that the housemaid was just laying when Clara came in. Miss Pip Whitmore was 9 years old, very small for 9, fair as a candle, and sitting on the hearthrug in a yellow muslin dress, with a globe between her knees, turning it slowly with one finger, and announcing the names of the oceans to a grey cat who was not listening. "Pacific," said Miss Pip. "Atlantic. Indian. Southern. Arctic. There are 5, and they all touch. Mamma says there are 4, and the 5th is only an idea, but Papa says ideas are oceans too." "Are you the new governess?" "I am." "What is your name?" "Miss Ashbrook." "Mine is Pip. I am called Pip because my second name is Philippa, and my first is Augusta, and nobody could bear to call me Augusta. It would be like calling a wren a goose. Will you teach me oceans?" "I will teach you whatever your mother engages me to teach you." "Then it will be French and pianoforte and watercolour and embroidery, which I detest in unequal measure. And oceans I shall have to teach myself." She spun the globe under her finger and watched South America go past. "Have you met my sister Amelia?" "Not yet." "Have you met my sister Amelia's intended?" "Not yet." "Have you met the Duke?" Clara paused. She had been kneeling to take off her travelling bonnet, and the ribbons had knotted, the way ribbons did when one had walked 2 miles through gates and gardens, and one's hands were unaccountably cold. She found that the question wanted attention. "I met a gentleman at the kitchen garden door who said his name was Merryworth." "That's the Duke," said Pip, with the patient kindness of a child explaining a thing one had not understood. "He is going to marry my friend Sophronia. Sophronia does not wish to marry him. She wishes to marry the curate at Branwell, which my mother says is a most unsuitable thought. I'm not supposed to know that. You are not to tell." She regarded Clara with grave consideration. "Did you like him?" "I have no opinion of him," said Clara, untruthfully, and the cat, who was wiser than the 9-year-old, opened one yellow eye and shut it again. The bell for first dressing rang. The housemaid came in with hot water and set the can down on the washstand and dropped a small bobbed curtsy to Clara at the table. "Beg pardon, miss. The under-butler said to tell you supper for the schoolroom is at 6, taken up by myself, and that if you wish anything brought from the still room, a tisane, a slice of seed cake, you have only to ring." "Thank you," said Clara. "Tell the under-butler I should be very glad of plain tea and nothing else." "Yes, miss." The housemaid hesitated at the door. "Miss, Annie Polwheelers is, miss, in the kitchen. She said to tell you, if you was wondering about the gentleman of the house, that the Duke went out to the orangery again after you came in, and stood at the wall a quarter of an hour, and went back to his rooms without speaking to no one." "Did he?" said Clara evenly. "Thank you, Annie's friend. I had not been wondering." The housemaid curtsied again and went out, with the unmistakable expression of a girl who had been instructed to gather and report. Pip rose, set the globe on the schoolroom table with the small, precise care she gave to all her instruments, and went to her own bedroom, in the next but one door, to be dressed for the children's supper. Clara sat down at the schoolroom table, with her hands flat on the smooth wood. Why, she asked herself, did one always learn the thing one did not wish to know at the precise moment one had resolved not to ask? Outside the windows, the orangery caught the last of the sun. She could see, from this height, that there were 3 figures down by its long brick wall. A tall, fair lady in pale rose, a shorter, dark one in white, and a third, in something the colour of green apples. And that they were standing very close together, heads bent, like 3 girls who had been schoolgirls together and were conferring on a piece of strategy that none of them wished the others' mothers to overhear. They were Lady Amelia Whitmore, Miss Cecilia Branwell, and Lady Sophronia Halloway, 2 earls' daughters and the daughter of a marquis, the 3 brides of the Merryworth Easter wager. She had no way yet of knowing it. She knew only that her hands were cold, and that she had told a 9-year-old a small lie about a man she had met by the orangery wall, and that the lie had been less for Pip's protection than for her own. "What?" she asked the empty schoolroom, very low. "Do you suppose you are about, Clara Ashbrook?" The grey cat, who had returned to the rug and curled into a perfect circle, did not answer. It had never, in its considered opinion, answered a question that did not concern fish. She read by candle in her room until the great clock on the gable struck midnight, and then she put out the candle, lay down on the narrow bed under the eaves, and lay awake for almost an hour before sleep would come. The Duke of Merryworth, at that hour, was in his own bedroom on the south front, sitting on the floor in his shirt-sleeves, with his back against the cold marble of the chimney-piece, examining the wager. He had taken it out of his coat pocket, where he had been carrying it all the long ride down from London. A single sheet, the footman's copy, folded twice and sealed with the steward's plain wax. He had broken the seal on the carriage drive, while the 4 greys had picked up speed for the home stretch, and read his own words back to himself in the swinging coach lamp, and had felt, for the first time since he had laid his hand on the page at White's, a small, cold horror. It was the horror of a man who has agreed to a thing in company, and is now obliged to perform it in solitude. It was also the horror of a man who has only just understood how thoroughly he has been thinking for the last 8 months of something he had not given himself leave to name. He was 27. He had been Duke of Merryworth since his 19th birthday, the title and 3 estates and the Carlton House debt falling on him in the single appalling week after his father's death. He had buried his father, he had paid the debt, he had taken his seat in the Lords, and learned in 2 seasons to be respectable enough to be feared, and unrespectable enough to be amusing, which was the difficult balance his late father had not managed. He had become engaged in November to Lady Sophronia Halloway, daughter of the Earl of Branwell, because his mother and her mother had been at school together and had decided it in the year that he and Sophronia were both 16, and neither of them had thought, at the time, to object. Sophronia did not love him. He did not love Sophronia. They had been agreeable to each other in 3 London drawing rooms and 1 Hampshire garden party, and they would have made what their mothers called a creditable couple, and what he himself privately called a long, quiet, well-bred mistake. 8 months ago his mother had died. The Duchess had been ill for 3 years. She had been an exacting, witty, demanding woman, whose verdicts had been the terror of 3 drawing rooms in 2 counties, and she had also been the one person in his life who could, with one look across a dinner table, tell him he was being a fool. She had died in August, in the Rose bedroom at Merryworth, with her hand on his wrist, and her last sentence half finished. The sentence had begun, "Merryworth, if you marry that girl," and had not been completed, because she had run out of breath. He had not, in the 8 months since, finished it for her. He spread the wager on the marble floor and looked at his own hand. The Duke of Merryworth, Lord Henry Sefton, and Mr. Tobias Vance wager their respective engagements. He had meant it as a joke. He had meant it as the kind of joke he had built his early reputation on, the joke that was actually an edge dressed for company. He had meant Sefton, whose mother was destroying him in slow, careful installments by marrying him to a girl he had loved since he was 16 and could no longer speak to, and Vance, whose father was destroying him faster by marrying him to an earl's daughter the family ledger could not, however tortured, afford, and himself, whose mother had run out of breath before she could destroy his engagement for him. 3 engagements that ought, by his private accounting, to be unmade. 3 friends who would not, separately, find the courage. He had given them a dawn. The fire in the grate cracked once. He folded the wager and laid it on the marble, and rested his head against the cold pilaster behind him, and shut his eyes. He had not, when he laid his hand on the page at White's, expected to walk to the orangery the next afternoon and find a small, composed person in a green wool cloak standing in front of his mother's glasshouse, as though she had seen it in a book and had now come to inspect it. He had not expected her to look at him with an expression that suggested he was, on first inspection, neither a duke nor a problem, but a man, on a path, who had been there a moment longer than was easy to explain. He had not expected to want, with an immediate, stupid clarity, to ask her what she was thinking. He had asked her, instead, whether she was a bride. He laughed once, briefly, at the ceiling. Then he stood up and walked to the window. The orangery showed below him in the moonlight as a long, pale ribbon along the kitchen garden wall. There were no figures by it now. Somewhere in the second-floor north wing, a candle was still burning behind a curtain. He watched it for a moment, without knowing whose room it was. He had a guess. He did not test it. He went to bed. Sleep, for some time, refused to come. The next morning, Lady Amelia Whitmore came down to breakfast before her mother, and sat at the long table in the breakfast room with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged into the polite, attentive look she had been wearing for so many months that her face had begun to take its shape from it. She was 22. She had a long, pale plait wound twice around her head, eyes the precise grey of February rain, and a way of holding her spoon that her drawing master had once said was the most accurate single gesture he had ever seen in a debutante's portrait. She had loved Lord Henry Sefton since she was 16. She had agreed to marry him in November of the previous year, in a drawing room in Berkeley Square, in front of her mother and his mother, after a proposal that had been so prepared, so rehearsed, so emptied of the man, that she had walked back to her own room afterwards and stood for a full hour at her window and wondered whether she had imagined the man she remembered. He had been frightened of his mother. He had been frightened of the settlement her father had drawn. He had been frightened, she thought, of how much he had wanted her. And so he had said the wrong, careful, drawing-room thing. And she, because she had been raised to politeness, had given him the right answer. She had been losing him by inches every week since. The breakfast-room door opened. Lord Henry Sefton came in riding clothes, with the dust of the home park still on his boots, looking like a man who had not slept, and had been pretending, for an hour at least, that he had. He stopped when he saw her. He glanced at the footman. He glanced at the sideboard. He glanced at the window. Then, with an effort, she watched him make and disliked herself for watching. He came across the room and bowed over her hand and sat down 2 chairs away. Amelia. Henry. You came down early. I did not sleep. Nor did I. They sat in silence. The footman placed coffee in front of her. The footman placed coffee in front of Sefton. The footman, who had been at Merryworth for 19 years and had served 3 engagements at this same table, withdrew to the sideboard and busied himself with a chafing dish. There is a wager, said Sefton, very low, that Merryworth has entered into in the book at White's, concerning the engagements. The 3 of them. Yours, mine, Vance's.
Amelia did not lift her cup. She was, by training, capable of a great stillness when she needed it. She had been so still at her own engagement party that her cousin had asked, afterwards, whether she had been ill. "What does the wager say?" He told her. He told her in 3 sentences, looking at the window. He told her without softening any clause. When he had finished, she set down her spoon and looked at him for the first time that morning with the full focus of her February grey eyes. And he, who had been her schoolroom companion since they were both 10 and had ridden the same pony, flinched. "You signed." "I signed." "Henry," she said, and the word was not cruel. It was, in fact, the gentlest word she had spoken to him in 4 months. "Henry, do you wish me to walk to the orangery before dawn on the 28th of March? Or do you wish me not to?" "I do not know." "That is, I think, the most honest sentence you have spoken to me since November. It is, also, an answer." She rose. The footman bowed her out of the room without looking at her. She walked the length of the gallery to the schoolroom stair without changing her pace once, and through every one of the 84 steps she held her face perfectly still. At the schoolroom door she paused. She heard, on the other side, a child's voice and a woman's lower one, conducting an exchange in French that was, she listened a moment, about a frog and a peach, and a small impertinent duke who had stolen both. She heard her sister Pip laugh. She did not go in. She turned and walked back the way she had come. By the 3rd day, the house party had gathered. The Marquess and Marchioness of Pencarrow had arrived in a coach and 4 with Lady Amelia's 2 younger brothers and a quantity of luggage that had required 2 extra rooms. The Earl and Countess of Branwell had brought Lady Sophronia and her younger sister Miss Cecilia in a coach of more modest fittings, but greater grim determination. Mr. Tobias Vance had ridden up from town with his father the banker and his mother in the carriage behind. All 3 of them aware that this house party was the public ratification of an engagement that the Branwell family had agreed to with their teeth set. The Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow, Lady Amelia's grandmother, the Marquis's mother, a small, beautifully dressed woman of 72 who had once been the terror of 3 London seasons and had outlived 3 husbands and a great many of her own opinions, had arrived in a chair, carried by 2 footmen, and had immediately demanded a fire in her dressing room of a particularity of warmth no housemaid had ever achieved on a first try. Merryworth was, by Friday, a houseful of 43 above stairs and 91 below, and Clara Ashbrook was an entirely invisible person in the 2nd floor north corridor, which was exactly what she had been engaged to be. She kept to the schoolroom. She taught Pip French and the names of all 8 winds. She corrected Pip's pianoforte without ever sitting close enough to feel for the child's small, inaccurate hands, because Pip had told her on the first morning that her last governess had pressed her fingers into the keys, and Pip would prefer not to be touched while playing. She read aloud from Mr. Cooper after tea. She wrote a letter to her aunt in Stow-on-the-Marsh, full of the kind of cheerful, neutral sentences a governess writes when she is not yet certain whether she has been hired for the season or for the fortnight. After the first afternoon, she avoided the kitchen garden entirely. She did not see the Duke. She thought, twice, she heard his voice in the gallery below her stair, in conversation with the steward about the orangery furnace. On neither occasion did she lean over the banister. On the 4th morning, Pip ran into the schoolroom with a sealed note in her hand. "From the Duke," she said, and presented it with the gravity of a small ambassador. "He gave it to me on the stair. He said I was to give it into your hand and to no other. He said if my mother saw me give it to you, he would, in great solemnity, blame himself. I am very pleased with this entire commission." Clara took the note. She broke the seal. She read it. It said, in a hand that was upright, clear, ill-suited to a love letter, and entirely suited to a man who had spent 8 years signing leases and remonstrating with stewards. "Miss Ashbrook, there is a glass house here, of which my mother was inordinately proud.
The undergardener has the key. He has been instructed that you may walk in it whenever it pleases you, at whatever hour, alone or with the child, by your discretion entirely. The orangery does not bear visitors in the Easter week. It will be empty after sunset. I do not write to invite myself, only to put the key into your hand, which the building, I think, ought to have, since it pleased you at first sight. Messieurs. She read it a second time. She read it a third time, slowly, looking for the place where it asked her something. She did not find one. She put the note in the drawer of the schoolroom table beneath her copy of Mr. Cowper. "Was it good news?" said Pip, who was sitting on the rug with the globe again, and watching with the unwavering attention of a child who had not been told it was rude. "It was," said Clara. She stopped. She had been about to say a polite untruth. She found, faintly to her own surprise, that she did not wish to. "It was a kindness," she said instead, "from your sister's host. He has given me leave to walk in the orangery whenever I wish, which I shall not do. But it was kindly meant." "You shall," said Pip. "You shall walk in it on Easter morning, before anyone else is awake, and you shall tell me what it smells like inside. I have never been in an orangery. Mamma says they smell of nothing in particular, but Mamma has not been in this one. Will you?" "I shall consider it," said Clara, who had no intention of considering it at all, and went to put coals on the fire because the schoolroom had become unaccountably cold. The Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow rang for her granddaughter at 11 that same morning. She rang on the small silver bell that her late husband had given her on the morning of her 35th birthday, and that she had brought from house to house with her ever since. And she rang it twice, briskly, with the small, clear authority that meant she was not in a mood to be kept waiting. Lady Amelia came at once. She found her grandmother sitting upright by the fire in a high-backed chair, in a gown of soft dove grey that had been made in 1799, and had been altered 7 times, and would last her 3 more winters, with a small, flat object in her lap that her thumb was turning slowly. Amelia, who knew her grandmother's hands very well, sat down opposite her without being invited, and waited. The dowager turned the small, flat object once more. It was an ivory miniature in a tortoiseshell case. Amelia had never seen it. "My dear," said the dowager. Then she stopped. She lifted the miniature, opened the case, looked at the small, painted face inside, closed the case again. She did this without ceremony. She set the case on the small marquetry table beside her chair and laid her hand flat over it, as a person lays a hand over an object she means to leave there, deliberately, while she speaks. "I shall tell you," she said, "what I should have told your mother 30 years ago. I shall not tell you whom this is. There is no use any more in the name. I shall tell you only that he was a curate, in a parish I am not at liberty to name, and that I did not marry him because my mother would not permit it, and that I have, in 72 years, made many decisions of which I am proud, and a great number of which I am not, and that one decision, made by my mother, has sat in my dressing table for 56 years, without my having found in all that time anything to do with it but turn it over now and again, when no one is looking. Now I look at you, my dear, and your face is composed, and your eyes are dry, and you have been engaged to that pleasant, frightened boy for 4 months. And yesterday morning at breakfast, you spoke to him for the first time since November, as though you were a woman, and not a portrait. And I should be very sorry if you spent the next 56 years of your life turning over a small, painted face in a dressing table that you might have, instead, gone out into the garden and married." Amelia could not for a moment speak. She watched her grandmother's hand, which was thin and beautiful and freckled, and absolutely steady on the lid of the case. "Grandmother," she said at last. "I do not advise you," said the dowager. "I tell you a thing. What you do with it is your own affair. I have observed, in 72 years, that we tell the young what to do, and they do the opposite, and that we tell them a true thing, and they remember it. So I tell you the true thing." She lifted her hand off the case. She put the case back into the small pocket of her gown. She did not look at Amelia again. She picked up her embroidery, a piece she had been working at since November, and began to set a stitch with a hand that had no tremor in it at all. Amelia went out of the room. She walked, this time, all the way to the orangery door before she remembered she had not put on a shawl, and she stood at the orangery door for some considerable time in the cool spring air, with her arms folded against her ribs and her face composed, looking through the panes at the great pale leaves of her host's mother's lemon trees, before she went back to the house to write a letter she had been meaning to write for 4 months and had not, until that morning, known how to begin. By the 5th day, every soul above stairs at Merryworth had heard of the wager. It had escaped White's, as wagers always escaped White's, by way of a footman who had a brother in service to the Pencarrow household, and the brother had said it to the under-housemaid at the Pencarrow townhouse, and the under-housemaid had said it to her cousin, who was lady's maid to Miss Cecilia Branwell, and the lady's maid had said it, careful, scandalized, accurate, to Miss Cecilia at her dressing table on the night before the Branwell carriage left for Merryworth. By the time the carriage had reached the home park, Miss Cecilia had told her sister Sophronia, and Sophronia had told no one, and had wept for half an hour in her travelling cloak in the corner of the carriage. And Miss Cecilia had told Lady Amelia on the staircase the day after their arrival, and Lady Amelia had told nobody, because she did not need to. The Marchioness of Pencarrow heard it at dinner on the 4th night, from her sister-in-law in a whisper behind a fan, and had nearly choked on a sole. The Marquis heard it from his wife at midnight, and had not, for the rest of that night, slept. The Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow heard it, by what means no one ever afterwards established, before any of them, and had said nothing to anyone except her embroidery. Her embroidery, the next morning, had advanced by 3 full inches. The Duke himself was the last to know that the house knew. He learnt it from his under-butler, who was a man of 19 years' service, and who took the small, deliberate, characteristic step of bringing the Duke his shaving water at 6 o'clock on the 5th morning, rather than at 7, and standing 1 pace farther from the washstand than usual, and saying, with a particular flat voice in which long-serving servants tell their masters that they have brought a problem with the towels, "Your Grace, the wager has come up from town." Merryworth, in his shirt-sleeves at the washstand, did not turn. "Has it?" "Yes, Your Grace." "How thoroughly?" "All the upper servants, Your Grace, the Marchioness, the Earl, the Dowager, the 3 ladies." "Miss Ashbrook." It came out of him before he had quite known he meant to say it. "Miss Ashbrook, Your Grace, has not been told, to my knowledge. The under-nurse who waits on her at present has been instructed not to repeat servants' gossip in the schoolroom corridor. Miss Ashbrook would in any case not entertain it. She is not—" Here the under-butler chose his word with the precision of a man writing it on glass. "She is not the kind of person who hears these things." "No," said Merryworth into the basin. "She is not." He finished shaving. He dressed. He went down. He met the Earl of Branwell, Sophronia's father, a stout, anxious, decent man whom he liked and did not respect, on the landing of the grand stair, and the Earl looked at him without speaking, and went past him with the shamed, stiff politeness of a man who has discovered his future son-in-law has done a vulgar thing in public, and would prefer not to mention it before the servants. He met the Marchioness of Pencarrow, Lady Amelia's mother, a small, precise woman of 45 who carried her opinions like a fan, at the foot of the stair, and she looked at him with a smile that did not move any of the muscles around her eyes, and said, "Merryworth, such a pleasant morning. The lilac is early," and went on to the breakfast-room. He met the Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow at the door of the morning-room, and she put up her glass and looked at him through it for what felt to him like a very long time, and let it fall on its ribbon, and said, "Merryworth, you will, I hope, contrive to be cleverer this week than you have been clever. I am too old to enjoy disappointment." "Ma'am," said Merryworth. She passed him. He went into the morning-room. The 3 brides were there. Lady Amelia Whitmore was at the window, with her back to the room. Miss Cecilia Branwell was at the writing desk, ostensibly sealing a letter, in fact, watching the door in the small mirror set into the inkwell. Lady Sophronia Halloway was on the sofa, with her hands folded in her lap and her face turned, deliberately, to the portrait of his mother above the chimney-piece. He shut the door behind him. "My ladies," he said. "Miss Branwell, I owe each of you an apology that no apology will cover. I came down to give it before breakfast for that reason." Sophronia turned her head. She was 23, fair, slight, with eyes the soft grey-green of new leaves, and a mouth that had a pretty firmness her mother had been trying to soften for 10 years. Today, she did not look soft. "Merryworth," she said, "do not waste your apology on the three of us. Save it for our fathers. They are the ones who signed the settlements." "I shall apologize to them. I am beginning with you." Cecilia, at the desk, set down her wax. She was 20, dark, vivid, the sister Sophronia had always called the dangerous one, meaning by it the one who said aloud in mixed company the thing the rest were thinking and had agreed not to say. "You may begin with me," said Cecilia. "I shall be brief. My family has spent 4 months telling me that I am marrying Mr. Vance because his father's bank holds a paper of my father's. Mr. Vance has spent 4 months telling me, by the careful avoidance of my eye, that he is marrying me because his father insists that an alliance with an earl's daughter is worth the paper. The two of us, between us, have not exchanged 30 words on any subject that did not involve the weather. I do not love him. He does not love me. I am 20 years of age, and I've been engaged to him for 11 weeks, and I have, in those weeks, lost 7 pounds and a thing inside my throat that I would prefer to recover. Your absurd wager, Merryworth, has given me a thing I lacked. I shall be in the orangery before dawn on the 28th. I shall not kiss Mr. Vance. I shall, in great public clarity, fail to kiss Mr. Vance. And the engagement will, by the terms of your own infamous page at White's, be void. I thank you." She said it without rising. She said it without raising her voice. Her hand, on the wax, was perfectly steady. Merryworth bowed. He could not, for an instant, speak. "Merryworth," said Lady Amelia at the window, without turning round, "I shall also be in the orangery before dawn. I shall also fail to be kissed by Lord Henry Sefton. I shall do it, however, with less ceremony than my friend Cecilia. I think Henry will not, in the end, come to the orangery at all. If he does, I shall be very kind to him, and I shall, when the kindness is finished, tell him what I should have told him in November in Berkeley Square, which is that I've been loving a boy for 6 years, and the boy went away from me when he became frightened of his mother, and that I should very much like to know whether the boy will come back." She turned. Her eyes, when they met his, were not unkind. They were not, in fact, even angry. They were absolutely clear. "You have, Merryworth, by your idiot wager, given me a door. I propose to walk through it." He bowed to her. He could not look at her, for a moment, without his throat tightening. For Sefton, and for himself, and for the 8 years he had spent thinking that the public sentence was always the bravest one a man could speak. He turned to Sophronia. Sophronia rose. She walked to him until she was 2 paces off, exactly the courteous gentleman's distance he had drawn at the kitchen garden door with Clara, and she put out her hand to him. He took it. It was cool. It was steady. It was the hand of a woman who had also, this week, learned what it cost to speak a clear sentence. "Merryworth," she said, "I shall not be in the orangery at any hour." He could not, for a moment, understand her. "I shall not walk down before dawn. I shall not invent a confrontation. I shall, instead, write to my father this morning and tell him that I have, on consideration, decided I cannot marry you. and that I should be grateful if you would inform my mother. And I shall do this without reference to your wager, because your wager is not the reason. The reason is that I am in love with a curate in the village of Branwell, who has loved me, with patience and without expectation, for 2 years, and whom I shall marry as soon as I have my father's reluctant consent. I should have told you in November. Politeness, in which I was raised, kept me silent. I tell you now, because you have given me, by your great public foolishness, the cover under which a private truth can be spoken without ruin. I am. And here, for the first time, her composure thinned. I am sorry I did not speak it sooner. I am also grateful that you spoke first. She let go his hand. She walked past him out of the morning room and closed the door behind her. The three of them stood in the silence she had left. Well, said Cecilia, after a long moment, in a voice that had something not quite under it. That is 1 engagement. 2, said Amelia, very quietly, at the window. 3, said Merryworth, who had been counting from the beginning, and who sat down very suddenly on the arm of the chair beside the fire, because his knees, which had carried him through the Lords and the Carlton House debt, and his mother's last sentence, had stopped, briefly, working. He did not walk in the kitchen garden that day. He could not have borne to be seen walking in it. He went instead to the library and shut the door, and stood at his late father's writing table and put both hands flat on the leather, and thought, very deliberately, for half an hour, about Clara Ashbrook. He thought about her green wool cloak. He thought about her mud-spattered hem. He thought about her composed, steady face at the orangery in the bright slanting sun. He thought about the way she had said, I am not any kind of bride, with the precise, dry politeness of a person who had been mistaken for the wrong thing once too often, and had stopped being amused by it. He thought about her hands on the schoolroom table, which he had not seen but could imagine, small, capable, ink-stained at one finger from the morning's lessons. He thought about the candle behind the second-floor north curtain at midnight on the first day, which he had not, at the time, known was hers. He thought about the way she had looked at his mother's orangery for almost a full minute without speaking, as though she had been let into a private place. He thought about the wager. He had given 3 women a door. Of the 3, 2 had walked through it on terms he had not foreseen, and one, the one his mother had nearly named with her last breath, had walked through it on terms he himself ought, in justice, to have foreseen, and had not. The wager had done its work. It had also exposed him to himself, as the kind of man who solves his own cowardice by setting it on a public page, and waiting for other people to draw the line for him. The Duchess, his mother, who had run out of breath before the sentence, would have called him an idiot, clearly, briefly, with the particular fond contempt she had reserved for him alone. And she would have been right. He went to the window. He looked across the park, in the direction of the orangery, which from this window was hidden by the slope of the lawn, and the great cedar his grandfather had planted in 1763. He had given the brides a door. He had not yet, for himself, opened one. He went up to the second-floor north corridor. He stood at the closed schoolroom door for the space of 3 breaths, with his hand half raised, and then he turned and walked away. He did not knock. He would not, while his own wager was still in force, knock. Whatever he was going to say to the small, composed person in the green wool cloak, he would not say it on the strength of a public page that had already cost 3 other women too much. He went back down. He spent the rest of the day in the steward's room, going through 8 months of accounts with the careful patience of a man trying very hard to be useful at something. On the 6th evening, Mr. Tobias Vance came to him in the library. Vance was 28. He was the only son of the elder Vance who had, in 1789, brought a small Bristol counting house up to a London bank by the simple expedient of refusing, for 15 years, to be respectable. Tobias was the respectable result. Eton, Oxford, 3 London seasons, a townhouse in South Audley Street, riding boots from Hobie, conversation that was almost but not entirely indistinguishable from a younger son of an earl. He had not, until that week, been in a duke's library at Merryworth. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the books, briefly, with the slight bewildered respect of a man who had been raised on ledgers and had never quite forgiven himself for liking the smell of leather binding. Merryworth. "Vance, sit." He sat. He set his glass aside. He looked at his hands, which were good, steady banker's hands, and then he looked up. "I came to say," he said, "that I shall not be in the orangery before dawn." "I supposed not. Miss Branwell has informed me of her intentions. She did me the courtesy this morning, in the gallery, before her mother." Vance's mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile. "She was very civil. At no point in the conversation did she dislike me. I should have preferred it, in some ways, if she had. It would have been easier to bear." "Yes," said Merryworth. "My father will be displeased." "Your father is a man of business. Your father will recover. My father has a paper of the Earl of Branwell's for £18,000. Merryworth set down his glass. He had not, he realized, thought through this part. It was the particular failure of his class to forget, in the swing of an Easter wager, that ordinary money was actually owed and would actually fall due on quarter day in the hand of a cit who had earned every pound of it. He looked at Vance with the particular attention he had not, perhaps, given him in any of their previous 4 meetings. "I shall take up the paper," he said. "Merryworth, I shall take it up at Lady Day, in full, in cash, against my own steward's draft on the Merryworth rents. Your father will be reimbursed in particularly comfortable specie. The Earl of Branwell will be relieved of a creditor, which is a debt of honour I shall owe to him, having attempted to ruin his elder daughter's engagement. Miss Cecilia will be relieved of a fiancé she had never, in any clause, loved. You will be relieved of a marriage that was, by your own account, a thing your father had transacted on you. And I shall be relieved, in some small part, of the picture I have been keeping in my head all week of 3 women in a morning room writing the consequences of my joke for me. Will you accept it?" "You." Vance stopped. He looked at the carpet. He looked, after a moment, back up. He was, Merryworth noticed for the first time, a perceptibly nice man, who had been suffering, very quietly, for some time. "You owe me nothing, Merryworth. It was the engagement of 3 families. You did not arrange it. I made it into a wager. I shall pay the price of the wager." Vance was quiet. Then he said, "I should be glad of it. Not for myself, for Miss Cecilia. She has been ill from this engagement for 2 months, and her mother has been pretending not to see. If the paper is gone from my father's drawer, her mother will have nothing left to hold over her, and she will be free. And she is a person, Merryworth, who deserves to be free. She is." Vance rose. He stood for a moment, hesitating, in the polite half-bow of a guest who is not certain whether he is permitted to take his leave on the strength of so private a sentence. "Merryworth." "Yes?" "Why did you do it? The wager, not the apology. I understand the apology. Why the wager?" Merryworth looked into the fire. He looked at it for some time. The fire, today, would not oblige him with an answer. "I gave 3 friends a door," he said at last, "because I was too cowardly to open one for myself. There is no better account of it than that. My mother died last August. She had begun a sentence to me in her last hour about my own engagement, and the breath ran out before the sentence did. I have spent 8 months waiting for somebody else to finish it. The wager was the last form of that waiting. It has not worked. The waiting will have to be done by me now, in private, like a grown man." Vance, after a long moment, said, "That is, I think, the most honest sentence I have heard from any gentleman at this house party. Good evening, Merryworth."
"Good evening, Vance." He went out. The door shut. The fire cracked. Merryworth sat in his late father's chair and looked at the books along the opposite wall, none of which he was, that evening, capable of reading. Easter morning was Sunday the 26th of March. The chapel at Merryworth had been built in 1671 of the same brick as the orangery, smaller, simpler, with a single bell that had been rung at every christening, wedding, and burial of the house for 144 years. The bell was rung at 9:30 that morning by an undergardener who had stood in for the regular bell ringer since the latter had been laid up by gout in the autumn. The household processed down the path through the lime walk, the Marquess and Marchioness, the Earl and Countess, the brides, the Dowager carried in her chair, the Duke at the head, the upper servants behind, the lower servants 3 paces farther back, Miss Pip Whitmore holding the hand of her sister Amelia and watching everything with very large eyes, and they took their seats in the cushioned pews that bore the small brass plates of 3 generations of Merryworth dukes. Clara, who had no claim to the family chapel, sat with the upper servants in the back row. She heard, behind her ribs, every word of the morning service. She did not look toward the front pew. She looked instead at the small wood carving of an angel on the underside of the pew in front of her, which a 4th Duke had ordered in 1748, and which had been carved by an estate carpenter who had not been able to read, but had carved an angel's face from memory of his own small daughter, taken by a fever 10 years before he was given the commission. She thought, after a while, that she would not, in the orangery on Tuesday morning, do as Pip had asked. She would not go before dawn. She would not see the bride's confrontations. "Did you make him?" Pip had asked her at breakfast about the angel, leaning over her toast. "The carpenter, I mean. Did you ever ask anyone if a real little girl was the model?" "I have not, Pip." "Well, you may, today, in chapel. I shall ask Mr. Henderson the steward at luncheon. He knows everything that is dated 1748. So she would walk in the orangery some other evening, when it was hers to walk in, with the undergardener's key in her glove, and she would smell what an orangery smelled like, and would describe it to Pip in particular and accurate words. She thought about the Duke. She thought about him not because she had any business thinking about him, but because, to her honest surprise, she could not, after 4 days, quite stop. He had sent her a key. He had not, since the kitchen garden door, spoken to her. He had not entered the schoolroom. He had not, in the public corridors, looked at her with any expression at all. She had heard, by way of Pip, that 3 engagements had been broken in 3 days. She had heard, by way of the under-butler, that the Duke had been very quiet at dinner the previous evening, and that he had not, after dinner, gone in with the gentleman, but had gone alone to the library, and sat there with 1 candle for 2 hours. She had, she told herself, no opinion of him. She had several opinions of him. They were arranging themselves, in her ribs, into a shape she did not entirely like. The service ended. The household processed back up the lime walk. The Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow, in her chair, paused as her bearers brought her past Clara, who had stepped aside to let the family go first, and said, into the air rather than to Clara directly, "Miss Ashbrook, the undergardener tells me you have a key to my late friend's glass house. Use it. She would have liked you in it. Walk on, Robert." The bearers walked on. Clara stood for a long moment with her hand at her throat, where her grandmother's small silver cross hung under her travelling bonnet, and she watched the small upright figure carried up the path under the new green of the limes, and she thought, with an entirely different shape of feeling, about an orangery and a key, and a woman she had never met whose son had stood at a kitchen garden wall and asked her whether she was a bride. The Easter ball was held on Monday the 27th. It was not, by Merryworth standards, large. The Duchess, his mother, had given great balls for 3 counties for 30 years, with 10 supper tables, and the regimental band of the local militia, and a flotilla of candles a footman had spent 2 days replacing. The Duke had ordered, for this ball, the small ball, the long gallery cleared, a single band in the gallery above,
the chairs set around the walls, the chandeliers lit at 6. No supper room, except the breakfast room thrown open with a cold collation. The carriages ordered for 1. The neighbouring families had come. Pencarrows, Branwells, Vances, the Winbridges from beyond the wood, the elderly Mr. and Mrs. Carteret from the Dower House, the Carteret nieces, a magistrate's family from the next parish, and a quantity of cousins who had been waiting 8 months for the Dowager Duchess's mourning to be lifted from the public dance card, and had now had it lifted with a vengeance. Clara had not, of course, been invited. She had taken her supper with Pip in the schoolroom at 6, helped Pip into bed at 7, read to Pip until 8, blown out the schoolroom candle at 8:30, and gone to her own room under the eaves at 20 to 9, with the intention of being asleep by 10, and rising at 6 to take Pip to the chapel for the Tuesday children's prayer. She had not slept. She had heard, faintly, from 2 floors below and across the house, the band tuning. She had heard, more faintly still, the first measure of the opening country dance. She had heard, when the breeze turned, fragments of laughter through her window which opened on the kitchen garden side. Once, very clearly, a woman's clear, ringing laugh that she thought was Miss Cecilia Branwell's. There was a soft knock on her door. She sat up. "Yes?" "Miss Ashbrook. Annie, miss, only Annie," the housemaid's whisper. "Miss Pip is awake, miss. She says she cannot sleep for the band, and she would like, if you was willing, a glass of water from your own jug, and a moment of your hand on her forehead, miss, because her own mamma is in the gallery, and I am told the Duke does not like the children's wing disturbed by maids when a governess is on call." Clara was already on her feet. "I shall come at once." She went in her shawl. Pip was sitting up in her small white bed in the next but one door, with her hair in a long fair plait over one shoulder, and her grey cat on her knees. She did not ask for water. She asked very seriously, "Will the brides be in the orangery tomorrow morning, Miss Ashbrook? I heard Annie's friends say so." "There will be no brides in the orangery tomorrow morning, Pip. The thing is concluded. Drink your water and go to sleep." "Will you go?" "I shall not." "Will the Duke go?" "I do not, Pip, know what the Duke will do. Sleep." She sat on the edge of the small bed and laid her hand on Pip's forehead until the child's eyes closed, and she went out very quietly. And she went back to her own room with the question Pip had asked her ringing in her ribs, like the clock on the gable. She had heard, at midnight, the great clock on the gable strike the half-hour. She had heard, at 1, the clock strike 1. At 1, she had heard the first carriages roll along the gravel under the front portico and away down the drive. And she had heard, from the gallery, the band play the small concluding waltz that ended the small ball. An hour later, when the house had begun to settle into the particular long silence of 43 above-stairs guests going up to bed by their own staircases, she sat up, under her thin quilt, and conceded that she was not, by any natural method, going to sleep before dawn. She thought about the orangery. She thought about it the way one thinks about a thing one has been avoiding for 4 days, for reasons one is not entirely willing to name. She had the key in her glove on the chair by the washstand. She had a green wool cloak hanging on the back of the door. The under-gardener slept in the gardener's cottage by the stable yard, and would not, on the ball night, be in the kitchen garden before 5. The Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow had said, into the air rather than to Clara, "Use it." The clock struck 3. "Well then," she said aloud, very low, to the small dark room. "Walk down or stay up? Choose." Clara rose. She washed her face in the cold basin. She dressed herself in the simplest of her 2 dresses, a soft grey wool with a high neck and long sleeves. She put on her cloak. She picked up the key. She paused at her own door for a long moment with her hand on the latch. She asked herself, as plainly as she could, "Are you walking down to smell an orangery? Or are you walking down on the chance of finding a man you have no business finding at this hour?" The honest answer, when she gave herself a moment to listen for it, was both, and chiefly the second. This time she refused, with deliberate care, to lie to herself. The Duke of Merryworth, she told herself, had retired with his guests an hour ago. He would not, at 4 in the morning on the day of his own wager, be walking in his own orangery. He had given the brides their door. The brides had used it on their own terms over the course of 3 days. The wager itself was a settled and concluded thing. There was no dawn confrontation arranged for the morning, because there were no engagements left to be tested by one. She would walk in the orangery for half an hour, smell the lemon leaves, and be back under her quilt before 5. She would tell Pip, after morning lessons, that the orangery smelled of warm earth and green leaves, and the faint dryness of paint on the brick. She would not, herself, ever come to this house again. The fortnight would end. She would go back to Stow-on-the-Marsh. She would put the Duke of Merryworth and his green glass house out of her ribs by the simple expedient of not, ever, mentioning either of them. She opened the door. She walked down the back stair on her stockinged feet, with her shoes in her hand. She crossed the green baize door into the upper servants' passage, and out through the kitchen garden door into the cold spring air. The hawthorn under the wall had opened its first white blossoms in the night. There was no moon. The east, above the homewood, had begun to show a single grey line of paler air against the black, which was not yet dawn, but was the long courtesy a country sky pays before the dawn comes. She walked along the wall to the orangery door, fitted her key, turned the lock, stepped in. The orangery was warm. It was warm because the furnace under the brick floor was kept at a low, steady heat against the spring frosts, for the sake of the lemon trees, which had been at Merryworth since 1773, and which were the great vanity of 3 generations of duchesses. The warmth came up through the brick into her stockinged feet. She had taken off her shoes in the kitchen garden, quietly, to keep the gravel from waking the undergardener, and had set them inside the door, and had not put them on again. The air in the orangery was full of a smell she had not been prepared for. It was warm earth, yes. It was green leaves, yes. It was also the dry, pleasant astringency of citrus, the way lemon peel smells if you press it between your fingers and then put your fingers to your nose, but doubled, layered, and threaded with something fainter and sweeter she could not, for a moment, name. Orange blossom. The single small orange tree at the far end was in flower. She walked the length of the orangery with one hand trailing on the long brick bench and her mouth slightly open, breathing. At the far end, by the orange tree, she stopped. The Duke of Merryworth was sitting on the brick bench under the tree, with his back against the south wall, his head tipped back, his eyes shut, in his shirt and breeches, with his coat folded beside him, asleep. Clara stood absolutely still. She had not made a sound coming up the orangery. He had not heard her. He had been there, she thought, for some time. There was a small lantern on the brick beside him that had burned almost out, and he had, evidently, sat down to wait for the dawn, and had not been able to stay awake for it. The lemon trees rose above him in their tall terracotta pots. The single orange tree above his head was in flower. His face, in sleep, was not the face she had carried for 4 days in her ribs. It was younger. It was tireder. It was the face of a man who had been, for 8 months, more lonely than he had perhaps told even himself. She should, she knew, turn around at once and walk back to the door, and go up the orangery the way she had come, and out into the kitchen garden, and up the stair, and under her quilt, and never, in any company, on any day, mention this to any human being living. She was a curate's daughter from Stow-on-the-Marsh. He was the Duke of Merryworth. He had, 4 days ago, broken 3 engagements with a sentence at White's. She had nothing to say to him at this hour, or any other. She did not turn. She set her hand very softly on the cool brick of the bench, and she stood looking at him for a long, careful moment. And then, because she could not bear that he should wake suddenly and find her watching him without speaking, which would be the unforgivable thing, she said very quietly, "Your Grace?" He opened his eyes. For a moment he held perfectly still. He looked at her with the slow, careful focus of a man who has been deeply asleep and is putting the visible world back in its proper places. The lantern's last flame steadied. His eyes, which she had not seen before in this light, were the green-grey of new lemon leaves. "Miss Ashbrook," he said. "I beg your pardon. The Dowager Duchess told me I might use the key. I had not slept. I did not expect." "You did not expect me?" "No. In truth, I had not intended to be here. I shall go at once." "Stay," he said. "Please, if you would. I have something I should very much like to say to you. I had thought I would say it tomorrow. I had thought I would knock at the schoolroom door tomorrow morning after the children's prayer. I had been composing it for 2 days. It will be better said now, I think, since you have walked in." She did not move. He sat up slowly, swung his legs to the floor, did not rise. He looked at her across 2 paces of warm brick. "There is no wager anymore," he said. "I owe you that fact first. The 3 engagements were broken on the 4th, 5th, and 6th days, on terms I did not foresee, and which I have not, in any sense, deserved to be relieved of. There is no orangery confrontation. There is no dawn test. I did not come down to test anyone. I came down because I could not sleep, and because the orangery was the only room in this house tonight that did not contain another person. And I was tired, Miss Ashbrook, of containing another person. I fell asleep, waiting for the sky to lighten. I shall be ashamed of this in the morning. I am not ashamed of it now." She listened. She did not speak. "I have been thinking about you," he said, "for 4 days. I have not knocked at your door, because I had a wager standing that I had been a coward to enter into, and that I would not, while it stood, allow myself to use as a reason to walk up your stair. The wager is gone. I cannot now even use it to disguise the fact that I have been thinking about you, because I have, simply, been thinking about you." He paused. He looked at his folded hands, as though he had not quite expected to find them there. "You met me at the kitchen garden door, and you looked at me as though I were a stranger on a path. And I was, for the first time in 8 months, quite glad to be a stranger on a path. I have, since that afternoon, been wondering what it would be to be that stranger to you again, in better company, on a more honest road." He lifted his head. The lantern guttered between them and steadied. "I have no claim on you. I am the kind of man who arranges public wagers about his own engagement and discovers, only when the wager is paid, that he has put his cowardice into the public book. You have, on the strength of 1 afternoon and 1 note, no reason to think any better of me than my under-butler does. I do not ask you to. I ask only that, when you go back to Stow-on-the-Marsh at the end of this fortnight, you do not entirely forget that there is a duke in a Kent orangery who would think of you, often, and with great clarity, even when he has no right to." He stopped. He folded his hands together on his knee. "That is what I would have said to you in the morning. It is what I have said to you now. I shall not detain you any longer in the orangery. The dawn is still—" He glanced at the panes above her shoulder. "Perhaps an hour off. I shall walk you back to the kitchen garden door." Clara had not, in all of this, moved. She had not moved because she had been listening, very carefully, the way she listened to Pip on a difficult French verb, for the place where the sentence broke and the truth came through. She had heard the place. It was somewhere between the first time in 8 months and quite glad to be a stranger on a path. She did not know, in the long, full silence after he stopped, where her hand had gone. She found that she had laid it, without intention, on the brick beside his folded ones, and that the warm brick was an inch from his thumb, and that she had not, in moving it, looked away from his face. "Your Grace," she said,
Merryworth.
Merryworth. I am a curate's daughter from Stow-on-the-Marsh. You are the Duke of Merryworth. I have no business in this orangery at this hour, with my hand on this bench an inch from yours. I should, by every rule I have ever been taught, be back in the schoolroom corridor in my stockinged feet. I am not. She drew in one careful breath. The warm citrus air went into her lungs and steadied her. I came down here because the Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow told me to, and because Pip told me to, and because I myself wished, for reasons I had not given myself leave to name, too. I am going to tell you a thing, and then I am going to walk back to the door. The thing is this. I have been thinking about you also. I had not given myself leave to. He had not moved. His hands had not moved. She made herself look at his face and not away from it. I shall, now that I have said it, give myself leave to think about it for the rest of my life, which will, very probably, last me longer than this fortnight, in which I shall return to Stow, and you will, if you continue to be the kind of man who pays Mr. Vance's father £18,000 in cash to release a young woman he does not love, become rather a better duke than the one who signed a page at White's. I do not propose to forget you. I do not propose to do anything else. I am going to walk back to the door. She did not walk back to the door. He rose. He did not move toward her. He stood, in his shirt and breeches, with the lantern guttering at his elbow, the small orange flower above his head, and he looked at her across the 2 paces, with the steady, alert gravity she had first read in him at the orangery wall, the gravity of a man examining an unexpected line in a ledger, and he said, very quietly, "Miss Ashbrook." "Yes." "Kiss me before dawn." She looked at him for a long moment. The sentence sat between them in the warm, citrus air. It was the wager sentence. It was the sentence he had spoken at White's 8 nights before. It was the sentence that had broken 3 engagements. It was, now, in this orangery, in his own quiet voice, addressed to no bride at all, but to her. A sentence offered, not demanded, with the small, visible cost on his face of a man who knew very well what he had just done with it. She crossed the 2 paces. She put her cold hand on the warm linen at his throat, where his collar was loose. He set his hand, very carefully, on the side of her face. She lifted her mouth to his. He bent his head to hers. The first touch of their lips was nothing like she had expected. Quieter than she had expected. Warmer than she had expected. Slower than she had expected. She tasted, distinctly, orange blossom. Afterwards, she could never enter an orangery anywhere in the kingdom without tasting it again. He pulled her, with the careful, unhurried strength she had felt at the kitchen garden door, in the weight of her own travelling case in his hand, against his chest. Her cloak slipped from one shoulder. This time she let it fall. Neither of them heard the orangery door open. What they did not see, because they were not looking, was that the small orangery door at the far end, the gardener's door, half hidden by a flowering camellia, had been quietly, separately opened 3 times in the half hour before they kissed. It had been opened the first time by Lady Amelia Whitmore, who had come down at 3, dressed in a pale rose travelling cloak, with her cousin Henrietta Winbridge at her shoulder for the sake of countenance, and with a folded letter sealed in her glove. She had walked the length of the orangery to the orange tree, found it empty, for the Duke had not yet come down, and had set the letter, addressed in her clear schoolroom hand to Lord Henry Sefton, upon the brick bench beside the lantern. Then she had walked the length of the orangery back to the door, with her cousin 3 paces behind her, and had gone out into the kitchen garden and up the slope to the home wood by the long path that led, at length, to the gate where she had, 8 years before, when she was 16 and he was 18, first kissed a boy named Henry Sefton on his way back from his pony club, and where, she had reason to believe, he would, this morning, having read her letter, find her. She had paused at the orangery door to look back once at the orange tree. The orange tree had not noticed her. It had been opened the second time by Miss Cecilia Branwell, who had come down at 3:30 in a green pelisse over her dancing gown, with a small candle of her own and a face she had washed in cold water for the courage of it. She had walked the length of the orangery to the orange tree, found the bench occupied by a single folded letter and a small guttering lantern, registered both, and then registered, by the door at the far end which had not been there before, the indistinct shape of a tall man entering by it in his shirt sleeves and going to the bench to sit down. She had stopped behind a tall potted myrtle. She had recognized the Duke. She had recognized that he was, very evidently, not waiting for her or anyone. She had backed out of the orangery on her stockinged toes, taken the side path along the kitchen garden wall, gone in through the side door of the breakfast room, and gone up the back stair to her own bedroom, where her sister, Sophronia, who had also not been able to sleep, had been sitting on the edge of her bed in her dressing gown, waiting for her. Cecilia had reported, in 3 sentences, what she had seen. The two sisters had looked at each other for a long moment. Then they had both, with the small, absurd, helpless quality that overcame Branwell women, on the rare occasions when life unexpectedly arranged itself in their favor, begun very quietly to laugh. It had been opened the 3rd time by the Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow. She had not, of course, come down in person. She had sent her own elderly maid, Mrs. Bell, who had been 41 years in her service, and who had, that morning, woken her at 3 because the Dowager had given precise instructions the previous evening about a small errand to be performed at 4. Mrs. Bell had walked the length of the orangery in her sensible flat shoes, found the bench occupied by a folded letter and a lantern, and registered the second small commotion she had been instructed in particular to watch for: the arrival of the Duke himself, whom she had observed pass the gardener's door at 3/4 by way of the kitchen garden. Then, by some 4:15, came the arrival of a slim, cloaked figure who had come up from the upper servants' passage in stockinged feet and a green wool cloak, and had walked the length of the orangery and stopped at the orange tree and said, very quietly, "Your Grace." Mrs. Bell, who had been a parlour-maid in a curate's house in Norfolk before she had been promoted at 23 into the Dowager's service, had recognized at once both the cloak and the address. She had stood behind the same potted myrtle from which Miss Cecilia had retreated, kept her breath very small, watched what was necessary and no more, and then withdrawn, silent as a moth, by the gardener's door. She had not, being Mrs. Bell, looked back. She had returned to the Dowager's dressing room at the 4:45. She had set down the candle. She had said, very low, "My lady, the orangery is in good order." The Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow, who had been sitting up in her bed in a cap, with her late husband's miniature in its tortoise-shell case lying open in her lap, had nodded once. She had closed the case. She had said, "Thank you, Belle. We may, I think, all sleep now." They walked back from the orangery together at 20:05. The east, above the home wood, had passed beyond the long courtesy of paler air into the first true grey of the dawn. The hawthorn under the wall had opened more of its blossoms. The blackbird who had sung her up the gate 4 days before sang again, somewhere in the kitchen garden, as though he had been keeping the time. Merryworth. Edmund, she could now, perhaps in private, in her own thoughts only, call him Edmund, walked half a pace behind her along the wall. Not until they reached the kitchen garden door did he touch her. He held her shoes in his hand. He had picked them up at the orangery door when she had remembered them only at the threshold, and he had not, on the walk back, given them to her. On the walk back, she did not ask for them. At the kitchen garden door, he set them down. "Miss Ashbrook." "Merworth." "I shall not knock at the schoolroom door tomorrow." "No." "I shall, on Wednesday, ride out with the steward to the Branwell living, to call upon the Earl of Branwell, and ask his pardon in person. I shall, on Thursday, attend Lord Sefton at his mother's house in Hertfordshire, and ask his. I shall, on Friday, sit with the elder Mr. Vance in South Audley Street, and pay him £18,000, which will not, by his lights, be the most ill-spent guineas his bank has ever taken. I shall return to Mereworth on Saturday. I should very much like, on Sunday, after the children's prayer, to knock at the schoolroom door, and to ask if you would walk with me in the kitchen garden, in the open daylight, before the whole household, at the hour and at the company of your own choosing. With your leave. She put on her shoes. She straightened. She looked at him across the cold spring threshold. You may, on Sunday, after the children's prayer, knock at the schoolroom door. He bowed. At the door he did not touch her. He stood as she stepped through into the upper servants' passage. He stood as she fitted the great key back into her glove. He stood as she walked the length of the passage in her stockinged feet, with her shoes loose against her ankles. And he stood until she had passed the green baize door at the far end, and the latch had clicked behind her. Then he too went in by the side door, and went up to his own room on the south front, and stood at his window in the grey first light, looking out across the home park toward the orangery. And he thought, very deliberately, for the first time in 8 months, Mother, if you marry that girl. And he finished, in his own voice, the sentence the Duchess, his mother, had not been able to finish. You will be marrying her for the wrong reason, and you will be very unhappy. And so will she. Do not. He stood with that finished sentence for a long moment, in the grey light, and then he turned away from the window and went to his desk and began to write a letter to the Earl of Branwell. The story of how 3 engagements collapsed at Mereworth in Easter week 1815 was told, of course, for the rest of the year, and it was told badly. It was told as a scandal. It was told as a duke's lunatic wager. It was told, in some quarters of town, with great relish, as the year's most amusing reverse on 3 foolish families. It was told, in other quarters, in lower voices, as a thing that had ruined 3 perfectly good matches for no good reason. It was told accurately, in the end, by very few people. The Dowager Duchess of Pencarrow told it accurately, in 3 sentences, to her elderly maid, Mrs. Bell, who had already known it. Mrs. Bell told it accurately to no one. The Earl of Branwell told it, in slightly different sentences each time, to his wife, who in the end did not mind. Her daughter Sophronia had married the curate of Branwell in the small parish chapel in May, in a gown of palest spring silk her grandmother had paid for out of the dowager's own private pin money, and her daughter Cecilia had, by midsummer, recovered the thing in her throat that had been missing since November. Lord Henry Sefton told it accurately, once, to his mother in Hertfordshire, in the conservatory of her own house, with his wife of 3 weeks at his side. He then refused ever again to discuss it with her. The wife was Lady Amelia Whitmore, who had been married at the chapel at Mereworth on the 1st of May by Sophronia's curate in a gown of pale rose. Mr. Tobias Vance told it accurately to his father over a glass of port. His father had, on consideration, agreed that 18,000 in cash on a duke's draft at Lady Day was as honest a settlement as a Bristol bank had ever taken, and had, with a small private surprise, found himself proud of his son for the manner of having taken it. Mr. Vance the younger had returned to his counting-house in the autumn, and had, by Christmas, become engaged, without his father's arrangement, to a Bristol shipowner's daughter named Eleanor Brace, whom he had known since they were both 8, and whom he had spent 4 years not allowing himself to write to. That summer, Mereworth told no one anything at all. He rode out with his steward. He paid his debts. He attended the Lords. He gave his apology to the Earl of Branwell on the Wednesday of Easter week, and to Lord Henry's mother on the Thursday, and to the elder Mr. Vance on the Friday, as he had said he would. He returned to Mereworth on the Saturday. He knocked, on the Sunday, after the children's prayer, at the schoolroom door. The schoolroom door opened onto a small, composed person in a plain grey wool dress, with her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck, and Pip on the rug behind her, with the globe between her knees, announcing the winds of the world to the grey cat. Clara stood for a moment, with her hand on the latch. "Mereworth," she said. "Miss Ashbrook, you may walk with me in the kitchen garden. I have an hour before the Tuesday lessons." "Pip, you shall walk with him, of course," said Pip, without lifting her eyes from the globe. "And you shall tell me, when you come back, what the orangery smelled like. You promised?" "It smelled," said Clara, looking at the Duke of Merryworth in the schoolroom doorway in the grey spring light, "of warm earth and green leaves and the dryness of paint on the brick, and, faintly, of orange blossom, which is the smell of a small tree in flower at the far end of the room. I shall describe it more fully when I have walked in it with the Duke in the daylight. Will that satisfy?" "For the moment," said Pip. They walked. They walked that morning, twice the length of the kitchen garden, in plain view of half the upper servants of the house, in the cold spring sun, with the hawthorn now fully out along the wall. He told her, as they walked, what he had said to the Earl of Branwell, and what the Earl of Branwell had said to him. He told her what Lord Sefton's mother had said in the conservatory at Hertfordshire, and what Sefton's face had looked like when his mother had said it. He told her that Mr. Vance had been embarrassed by the cash, but had taken it. He told her about the small brass cross on the schoolroom angel in the chapel pew, which he had not, in 8 years, looked at properly, and which a fourth Duke had ordered an estate carpenter to carve. He told her, finally, in the lee of the south wall by the door of the kitchen garden, that he was, slowly, finishing his late mother's sentence in his own voice, and that it had, to his honest surprise, been a kinder sentence to finish than he had expected, and that the kindness was, in some small part, owing to her. She told him, in turn, about Stow-on-the-Marsh, and about her father, who had been a curate of unusual gentleness and very poor health, and about her aunt who had raised her after his death, and who would, when Clara wrote with this story, very probably refuse to believe a word of it until they were both in her Stow parlour drinking weak tea. She told him about Pip. She told him about Mr. Cooper. She told him that she had, since the night in the orangery, slept rather well for someone who had not, before it, slept much at all. At the kitchen garden door he stopped. In the open daylight he did not touch her. "Miss Ashbrook." "Mereworth?" "I had thought," he said, "that I should not, in any honourable account, ask the next question of you for at least 3 months, and possibly for 6. I am a duke. You are a curate's daughter. I have ruined 3 engagements in a single Easter week. I should, by all the prudence of my office and yours, court you with great public slowness, and let the year, and your own steady judgment, answer the question for both of us. I propose to do that. I propose, in fact, to do it punctiliously. I shall ride down to Stow-on-the-Marsh in May, and present myself to your aunt, with the same politeness I gave the Earl of Branwell, and I shall ride down again in June, and in July, and in August. I shall write to you, with your aunt's permission, once a week. I shall not, by any contrivance, find myself alone with you in any orangery, or any other glass-house, for the entire summer. I shall be a model of slowness. I tell you this now so that you may, in private, between us, know that the question I am not yet asking you, the question I shall be earning the right to ask you by autumn, is the only question of which I am, at this moment, capable." Clara looked at him for a long moment in the cold spring sun. "Merryworth?" "Yes." "You may, in May, ride down to Stow-on-the-Marsh and present yourself to my aunt. You may write to me, with her permission, once a week. You may take the whole summer. You may, in October, perhaps, ask me the question. I shall give it the consideration it deserves, which will not, I think, take very long, because I have already given it some private consideration in advance. And on the day on which we walk out of the parish church at Stow, whichever year that is, I should like very much, if it would be possible, to be given a small tree in flower for the orangery." He laughed. He laughed in the cold spring sun, in plain view of 3 under-gardeners and an under-butler, and his laugh was the laugh of a man who had not, in 8 months, laughed in that exact way. And the under-butler, who was the same 19-year man who had brought the shaving water on the morning the wager had been found out, saw it, and said, very quietly, to the under-gardener at his elbow, "There, the house will do." The under-gardener, who was 61 and had been at Merryworth since the late Duchess's first season as a bride in 1771, nodded once. "Aye," he said. "It will." She walked, in October, the year following, out of the parish church at Stow-on-the-Marsh on Merryworth's arm, in a gown of pale spring silk that had been made for her by Sophronia Branwell's mother, who had become, after some discussion, a friend, with the small silver cross her father had given her under her bodice, and her green wool cloak, folded carefully into a bandbox, waiting in the carriage for the journey home. And at the carriage door, her new husband handed her up into the seat opposite him, and laid in her lap, as though he had been thinking of doing it for 18 months, which, in fact, he had, a small terracotta pot containing a single orange tree in flower, 2 feet high, very young, that the under-gardener at Merryworth had been raising from seed since the Easter Tuesday morning on which a small, composed person, in a green wool cloak, had walked the length of his orangery in her stockinged feet, and asked, very quietly, of the Duke of Merryworth, what the orangery smelled like. She took the small tree into her lap. For a moment she did not speak. The carriage rolled out under the lime walk of Stow parish, on the long road that would take them, in time, to Kent, and the spring afternoon, for it had become, by the wedding, the warmest October of the decade, was full of the soft, warm dryness of the lemon tree pots she would, by Christmas, learn to know each by name. The orange flower at her fingertip released, against her skin, the faint, particular astringency she had first tasted on a man's mouth in a warm orangery before dawn 18 months before, and that she would, now, in this carriage, and in every orangery and at every spring window of her long life, taste again, with the small, private surety of a thing that had, by careful, patient daylight work, become entirely her own. She closed her hand over the small pot. He set his hand over hers. "Merryworth," she said. "Edmund. Edmund." The blackbird, who had sung her up the long gate at Merryworth 18 months before, sang, somewhere in the lime walk at Stow, as though he had walked all the way down to fetch her home. If you have ever, on the strength of a single, small, honest sentence, spoken in the wrong room at the wrong hour, decided to walk through a door you had told yourself you would not, tell me about it in the comments. I should very much like to hear what was on the other side. If this story made the long drive shorter, leave a small word for the narrator below. And if you would like the next Adrian's Fireside story to arrive in your evening, the small candle in your own gable, 2 floors above the noise of the day, subscribe, and I shall light the next one for you next Saturday. Good evening from the fireside.